History's greatest battles are not always decided by the size of an army, but by the sheer, unbreakable will of those who dare to defy fate. On a cold autumn morning in 1274, as the waves of the Tsushima Strait rolled in like silent messengers of war, 200 samurai stood on the precipice of oblivion. Before them, stretching across the horizon like an unbroken wall of death, was an invasion force unlike anything Japan had ever seen. 50,000 Mongol warriors, armed with weapons beyond imagination, carried by a fleet so vast that the sea itself seemed consumed by their numbers. Their leader, the formidable Kublai Khan, ruler of the greatest empire the world had ever known, had never failed in conquest. Now he set his sights on Japan, and standing in his way on this tiny island were warriors who refused to surrender. The Mongol Empire was an unstoppable force, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the heart of Europe. They had crushed empires, shattered dynasties, and rewritten the maps of history. No nation that faced them had survived intact. The Song dynasty of China had fallen. The mighty cities of Persia had burned. Even the fearsome knights of Eastern Europe had been swept aside like leaves in the wind. To resist Kublai Khan was to invite annihilation. And yet, on this remote island of Tsushima, a mere speck on the map, a handful of samurai prepared to do exactly that. Kublai Khan's hunger for conquest was insatiable. Though he had claimed China and Korea, Japan remained a thorn in his ambitions, a defiant land just beyond his grasp. He had sent emissaries demanding surrender. The Japanese response? Silence. An insult that could not be ignored. In the halls of Xanadu, Kublai Khan's court burned with talk of retribution. The Mongols would not just conquer Japan, they would make it an example. The invasion was no longer a mere campaign, it was a lesson in absolute dominance. And it would begin with the utter destruction of Tsushima. The first whispers of invasion came not from spies or scouts, but from terrified Korean merchants who arrived in Japan bearing news that chilled the blood of its warriors. Along the Korean peninsula, the Mongols were constructing shipyards on an unprecedented scale. Vast warships, some unlike anything ever seen, were being built with terrifying efficiency. These weren't just vessels to carry men. They were floating fortresses, designed to bring war itself to Japan's shores. It was not a question of if they would come. It was a question of when. By the time the samurai of Tsushima received word that the Mongol fleet had set sail, the outcome of the battle seemed inevitable. Every logical thought, every rational mind would have reached the same conclusion: resistance was futile. The Mongols did not merely defeat their enemies. They erased them. Entire cities had been reduced to ash. Millions had fallen before their cavalry, their archers, their siege weapons. There was no hope for Tsushima. No reinforcements, no way out. But the samurai did not see logic as others did. They did not fight for victory. They fought because it was the only path their honor would allow. Lord Sosukakuni, the island's governor and a warrior of legendary discipline, gathered his men. He did not offer false hope. He did not promise survival. He did not lie. Instead, he told them the truth. They would not live to see the end of this battle. Their names would be forgotten by the Mongols. Their bodies would be burned or left to rot on the beaches. But what the Mongols did not understand, what no invader could ever grasp, was the heart of a samurai. This was not a battle of numbers. This was not about winning. This was about showing the world that the samurai of Japan would rather die standing than live on their knees. As the Mongol fleet cut across the sea, an eerie stillness settled over Tsushima. The villagers were evacuated. Fields were burned. Every possible resource that could aid the enemy was destroyed. The samurai watched from the cliffs as the black horizon drew closer. War drums echoed across the water, sending deep, bone-shaking tremors through the land. It was a sound designed to break the will of any defender before a single blade was drawn. But the samurai of Tsushima did not break. Then came the first sight of the ships. There were so many that they blotted out the horizon, moving as one, like an endless tide of death. The Mongols had arrived. On board, warriors from China, Korea, and the Mongol heartlands sharpened their blades, tightened their armor, and prepared for what they believed would be a slaughter. They had heard tales of the samurai, of their rigid code, their devotion to honor, but they had also been told that the battle would be swift. Kublai Khan had promised them victory in days. He had promised that Japan would crumble as easily as the Song dynasty before it. But as the Mongols neared the shores, something was wrong. There was no sound, no armies assembled on the beaches, no archers standing in formation, only the wind, the waves, and the distant cry of gulls. It was a quiet so unnatural that even the Mongol generals hesitated. Where were the defenders? Had they fled? Had they surrendered before the battle had even begun? That's when the first arrow flew. It came from the cliffs above, so fast and precise that it struck the Mongol officer directly in the throat, cutting off his command before he could even utter a word. Then another, and another. In an instant, the Mongols realized their mistake. The samurai were not waiting for them on the beaches. They were already hunting them. From the forests, from the rocky outcrops, from the shadows of the land they had called home for generations, the samurai struck with devastating precision. They did not fight as the Mongols expected. There were no grand formations, no traditional battlefield maneuvers. The samurai fought in small units, moving like ghosts through the terrain. One moment they were there, and the next they were gone, leaving only the bodies of their enemies in their wake. The Mongols had prepared for an army, but what they had found was something else entirely. They had found warriors who did not fear death. Warriors who had spent generations perfecting the art of war in the hills, on the beaches, in the forests of Tsushima. Warriors who had no intention of fighting for victory, but for something far more terrifying, the right to die as samurai. The first day of battle had only begun, but already the Mongols knew. They had stepped into a nightmare. The Mongol war machine was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Forged in the fires of endless conquest, it had swallowed empires whole, reducing mighty dynasties to dust and rewriting the fate of civilizations. Their warriors, hardened by generations of brutal warfare, had perfected the art of invasion. They were not just soldiers. They were the storm itself, rolling over battlefields like an unstoppable force of nature. Now, that storm was heading for Japan, and the first wave would crash upon the island of Tsushima. Kublai Khan, grandson of the legendary Genghis Khan, had reshaped the Mongol Empire into something even more terrifying than what his ancestors had built. He was not just a warrior, he was a strategist, a ruler, a man who understood that true power was not just about conquest but about absolute, undeniable dominance. China had fallen to him. The mighty Song dynasty, which had resisted the Mongols for decades, had crumbled under his relentless campaigns. Korea had bowed before him, its rulers now little more than vassals in his empire. Japan, however, remained defiant, a lone ember refusing to be extinguished. And that, in Kublai Khan's eyes, was unacceptable. For years, Japan had ignored his warnings. Emissaries had been sent bearing the Khan's demands: surrender and you will be spared. Resist and you will be annihilated. But Japan had responded with silence, a silence that was louder than any declaration of war. In 1268, the first whispers of invasion reached Kyoto, carried by merchants and spies. They spoke of shipyards rising along the Korean coast, of armies assembling, of a fleet so vast that it would darken the seas. At first, the warnings were ignored. Japan had always been protected by the sea, and no enemy had ever dared to launch an invasion across such treacherous waters. But as the years passed, the rumors became undeniable. By 1274, the Khan's patience had worn thin. He had already crushed Korea and forced it into submission. Now, he would use it as a launching pad for his greatest conquest yet. The invasion of Japan was not just about military expansion. It was about proving a point. Kublai Khan did not tolerate defiance. He ruled the largest empire the world had ever known, and yet Japan dared to act as if it was beyond his reach. He would show them otherwise. The Mongol war machine was built for one thing: swift, merciless conquest. This was not an army of reckless warriors. It was a force of terrifying efficiency. The Mongols did not fight fair. They fought to win. Their armies were a fusion of cultures, a melting pot of the best soldiers from every nation they had conquered. Mongol horse archers, the deadliest cavalry in history, rode alongside Korean infantry, hardened by years of war. Chinese engineers, masters of siege warfare, brought with them weapons that Japan had never encountered before. And at the heart of it all was something truly terrifying: gunpowder. The Mongols did not just wield swords and bows. They had weapons that could shatter stone and send flames dancing through the air. Their ships carried explosive bombs, crude but deadly, filled with black powder and shrapnel. When thrown into enemy ranks, they would burst apart with deafening force, cutting men down in a storm of fire and steel. The Japanese had never faced such weapons before. Their warriors were trained in the art of the sword, the bow, the spear. But what good was skill when faced with an enemy who could tear the battlefield apart with fire? The invasion fleet was something out of legend. Over 900 ships, built in the harbors of Korea and China, each one carrying the weight of an empire. The Mongols did not build fragile, narrow vessels like the Japanese. Their warships were massive, flat-bottomed behemoths, capable of carrying hundreds of warriors, siege weapons, and even cavalry. These were not just transports. They were mobile fortresses designed to crush anything in their path. Leading this monstrous force was one of the Khan's most brilliant commanders, General Lu Fuxiang, a veteran of the Korean campaigns, a man who had seen battlefields soaked in blood and emerged victorious every time. He had studied the maps of Japan, memorized the coastline, and knew exactly where to strike. His orders were simple: land on Tsushima, wipe out any resistance, and establish a foothold for the invasion of the Japanese mainland. The Mongols had planned for everything. They had prepared for every possible scenario. But there was one thing they had not accounted for: the sheer, unbreakable will of the samurai. Back on Tsushima, Lord Sosukakuni stood at the edge of his island, gazing out at the distant horizon. The reports had come in. The invasion fleet had set sail. Within days, the Mongols would be upon them. Every logical mind knew the truth. This was a battle they could not win. There were too many. Even if they fought with every ounce of skill they possessed, the numbers were impossible. There would be no reinforcements, no second chances. The only certainty was death. And yet, not a single samurai wavered. Sukakuni did not waste time on false hope. His warriors knew what they were facing, but they also knew that surrender was not an option. They had trained for this moment their entire lives. They had fought pirates, defended against raiders, honed their skills for years in battles both small and great. They would not run. They would not beg for mercy. As the final days before the invasion slipped away, Tsushima became a land of silent preparation. Signal towers were manned, ready to send warnings across the island the moment the enemy appeared. Caches of weapons were placed in hidden locations. Ambush sites were chosen with care. Rocky paths where the Mongols' numbers would mean nothing, thick forests where cavalry would be useless. The samurai sharpened their swords until they gleamed like lightning. They wrote their death poems, preparing themselves for the moment they would fall. Then, the first shadow appeared on the horizon. At first, it was just a smudge against the endless blue of the sea. But it grew, and grew, until the entire horizon was dark, filled with towering masts, fluttering banners, and the distant glint of armor catching the sun. The Mongols had arrived. The war drums began, pounding like the heartbeat of an approaching beast. The sound was unlike anything the samurai had ever heard, a relentless, thundering rhythm designed to terrify. It was a message: we are here. We are unstoppable. Surrender now or be crushed. The samurai did not surrender. As the first warships drew close, the air filled with the sound of horns and shouted commands. The Mongols prepared for an easy victory. They did not realize that the battle for Tsushima had already begun. The air was thick with the scent of salt and war. The Mongol fleet loomed over the horizon like an unstoppable storm, their banners rippling in the wind, their war drums pounding like distant thunder. On board the invasion ships, warriors from China, Korea, and the Mongol steppes stood ready, their weapons gleaming under the rising sun. The samurai of Tsushima should have felt fear. They should have looked upon the sheer scale of the enemy and realized that resistance was hopeless. But they did not. Instead, they stood in silence, their hands gripping the hilts of their swords, their eyes locked on the approaching enemy. Lord Sosukakuni knew the battle ahead was unwinnable. But victory was not the goal. Every man under his command understood the simple, undeniable truth: they would all die. But in death they would send a message, one that would be etched into the bones of history. They would not kneel. They would not break. They would face the greatest empire the world had ever known and show them the cost of invasion. If they could slow the Mongols for even a day, if they could spill enough blood to make them hesitate before moving deeper into Japan, then their sacrifice would be worth it. The Mongols had underestimated them. That much was clear. The enemy believed the battle would be over in hours, that the samurai would crumble before their superior numbers, that Tsushima would fall like every other city the Khan's forces had razed. They expected the samurai to line up in formation, to fight a battle of honor, to die cleanly on the beaches. But that was not the way this battle would be fought. The samurai did not intend to meet the Mongols where they were strongest. Instead, they would fight as warriors born of the land itself, using the very terrain of Tsushima as their greatest weapon. In the days leading up to the invasion, Sukakuni and his men had prepared every inch of the island for battle. They studied the coastline, memorizing every hidden cove, every rocky outcrop, every forested path that could be used to turn the terrain against their enemies. The beaches were not defended in force; doing so would be suicide. Instead, the samurai set up ambush positions in the cliffs and forests, hidden from sight but ready to strike the moment the enemy set foot on land. Silent signal towers were positioned across the island, ready to send messages the moment the Mongols made landfall. Small war bands of elite samurai were assigned to different locations, each with a simple but brutal mission. Strike fast, kill as many as possible, then disappear before the enemy could regroup. This was not going to be a conventional war. It was going to be a hunt, and the Mongols were the prey. But the samurai had one final weapon, one that the Mongols had no understanding of: their unbreakable will. Unlike the soldiers of the Khan's armies, the samurai did not fight for conquest or wealth. They fought for duty, for honor, for their families waiting in the mountains, for their ancestors watching from the spirit world. To a Mongol warrior, death in battle was a risk. To a samurai, it was an expectation, and that made them far more dangerous than the enemy could possibly imagine. The night before the invasion, the samurai gathered in the courtyard of their fortress, the torches flickering in the cold autumn wind. There were no grand speeches, no promises of survival, only a solemn, shared understanding. Each man wrote his jisei, his death poem, a tradition among warriors before battle. A few lines of poetry, not of despair, but of acceptance. A final statement before stepping into the abyss. One young samurai stood beneath the moonlight, brushing ink onto paper with steady hands. His poem was simple, yet carried the weight of generations. The autumn storm brings waves of invaders, but like the pine, we bend, never break. In the first light of dawn, the Mongol ships closed in. The samurai watched from the cliffs, their faces unreadable, their swords sheathed but ready. From the decks of the enemy warships, bronze gongs rang out, the sound reverberating across the island like a summons from the underworld itself. Then came the war horns, deep and terrible, rolling across the water like an earthquake, shaking the very air. The Mongols were announcing their arrival. They were not simply attacking, they were making a statement. The first ships reached the shore, their hulls grinding against the sand. Then, with the precision of an empire that had conquered half the world, the Mongols began their landing. Mongol warriors leapt into the shallow water, their boots sinking into the wet sand as they rushed forward, weapons raised, expecting an enemy to meet them head-on. But something was wrong. The beach was empty. There were no samurai standing in formation, no defensive line waiting to be broken. There was only silence. The Mongol officers hesitated. Where were the defenders? Had the island already been abandoned? Had the samurai fled into the mountains, leaving the island to be claimed without a fight? And then, without warning, the first whistling arrow cut through the sky. It struck its target, a Mongol officer standing near the front, directly in the throat. He staggered backward, eyes wide in shock, blood gushing from his mouth before he collapsed. A heartbeat later, a second arrow found its mark, then a third, then a dozen. The Mongols had walked into a trap. From the cliffs above, hidden in the jagged rocks, samurai archers rained death upon the landing forces. The first wave of Mongols, caught in the open, had nowhere to run. Warriors fell where they stood, arrows piercing through armor, cutting them down before they could even reach the tree line. Panic rippled through the Mongol ranks. The officers shouted commands, their voices rising above the chaos, but the samurai were already moving. From the forests beyond the beach, warriors emerged in small bands, striking fast and mercilessly before vanishing back into the shadows. The Mongols were accustomed to overwhelming their enemies, to forcing their foes into submission with sheer numbers. But here, on this island, their numbers meant nothing. They could not bring their cavalry to bear in the dense forests. They could not fire their arrows effectively while being attacked from above, from behind, from directions they could not anticipate. The landing zone became a slaughterhouse. The Mongols, realizing they could not advance, retreated back toward the sea. But the samurai had planned for this, too. Small boats, manned by local fishermen, maneuvered through the shallows, launching flaming arrows at the beached warships. Within moments, smoke and fire engulfed the shoreline. The Mongol commanders had no choice. They signaled for their remaining forces to pull back, regrouping on the remaining ships. The first wave had been shattered. The samurai had drawn first blood. But the battle was far from over. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the Mongols prepared for a second assault. And this time, they would bring the full fury of the Khan's war machine. The true battle for Tsushima was about to begin. The Mongols had been humiliated. The first wave, meant to establish a foothold on Tsushima, had been slaughtered before they could even push past the beaches. Their elite warriors, trained in the ruthless tactics that had conquered half the world, had been outmaneuvered by an enemy they had vastly underestimated. But the Mongols were not an army that accepted failure. They had taken cities, broken dynasties, and crushed empires. Japan would be no different. This was merely the beginning. As the sun dipped behind the mountains of Tsushima, casting the island in the deep orange glow of twilight, the Mongol commanders gathered on the flagship, their tempers simmering beneath the surface. Their leader, General Lu Fuxiang, a hardened veteran of the Korean campaigns, stood over a detailed map of the island, his fingers tracing the shorelines. He had assumed the samurai would meet them in direct combat, that they would die in an honorable but foolish stand. Instead, they had fought with cunning, with precision, with patience. It was not the battle he had expected. That would change. The new plan was brutal in its simplicity. Overwhelm the samurai with sheer force. No more small landing parties. No more cautious advances. This time, they would send thousands onto the beaches at once, supported by their most terrifying weapons. Gunpowder bombs, incendiary arrows, and siege weapons would clear the way. The Mongols had seen what the samurai were capable of when given the chance to strike from the shadows. Now they would burn those shadows away. Through the growing darkness, the Mongol fleet shifted into position. Hundreds of warships formed into a crescent shape offshore, their hulls bristling with warriors eager to redeem the failure of the first wave. Firelight flickered across the water as torches were lit, their glow reflecting off the polished armor of the invaders. From the decks of the largest warships, the first artillery bombardment in Japanese history was about to begin. From their hidden positions in the hills and forests, the samurai watched in grim silence. They knew what was coming. The Mongols had retreated not out of fear, but to unleash something far worse. Lord Sukekuni remained calm, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, his mind racing through every possibility. He had expected an overwhelming force, but he had not expected gunpowder. This was a new kind of warfare, one that no samurai had ever faced before. Then, with a deafening roar, the first Mongol bomb exploded. The night sky lit up in a flash of fire and smoke as the projectile shattered against the rocks, sending jagged metal and stone flying in all directions. A second bomb followed, then a third, raining destruction upon the island. The Mongols were not attacking warriors. They were attacking the land itself. The samurai had fought pirates, rebels, and rival clans for generations, but never had they faced an enemy that could destroy from a distance. Their armor, their swords, their bows, all were useless against the storm of fire and shrapnel now cutting through the trees, tearing apart the battlefield before the enemy had even set foot on it. Sukekuni's men took cover, pressing against the rocks as the bombardment intensified. The Mongols were using their Korean warships as floating artillery platforms, launching bomb after bomb into the forests, the valleys, the cliffs where the samurai had hidden before. The fires spread rapidly, turning the carefully chosen ambush sites into infernos of death. The Mongols were learning. They had seen the danger of allowing the samurai to control the battlefield. Now they would leave them nowhere to hide. When the first Korean infantry units landed, they did not charge recklessly as their predecessors had. Instead, they moved cautiously, shields raised, arrows nocked, scanning the wreckage for signs of movement. Behind them, Mongol heavy cavalry disembarked onto the shore, horses splashing through the shallows, ready to charge the moment resistance was found. This time, the samurai did not meet them in the trees. They met them on the beaches. Sukekuni himself led the charge, his katana flashing in the firelight, his warriors crashing into the Mongol front lines with a ferocity that stunned even the seasoned invaders. The battle exploded into chaos, steel meeting steel in a blur of motion and blood. Mongol soldiers, accustomed to fighting massed formations, found themselves engaged in brutal, close-quarters combat, their long spears and bows suddenly useless against the deadly precision of the samurai swordsmen. One by one, the Mongol warriors fell, their armor cut open with swift, surgical strikes. The samurai moved like shadows, dodging between the enemy ranks, striking where their armor was weakest, breaking their formations before they could take control of the beach. For a moment, it seemed as if the samurai might drive them back into the sea. Then the Mongol cavalry charged. From the side, a unit of heavy Mongol horsemen, clad in layered lamellar armor, thundered down the beach, their lances gleaming in the firelight. The samurai barely had time to react before the first impact sent warriors flying into the sand, bodies breaking under the sheer force of the mounted assault. Sukekuni turned just in time to see one of his men crushed beneath the hooves of a Mongol warhorse. He had fought cavalry before, but never like this. These were not simple mounted soldiers. These were warriors who had spent their entire lives in the saddle, men who could fire arrows while galloping at full speed, who could turn their mounts on a dime, who fought as one with their beasts. The battle turned. Samurai were forced back, struggling to regroup as the Mongols pressed the advantage. The cavalry swept through their ranks like a blade through rice fields, cutting down warriors who had no time to react. For the first time since the invasion began, the samurai were outmatched. Sukekuni gritted his teeth. He knew what had to be done. Raising his sword high, he shouted the order to retreat. Not a panicked retreat, not a rout, but a tactical withdrawal into the hills, where the cavalry would lose their advantage. The samurai fell back in disciplined ranks, covering one another as they moved toward the forest. The Mongol cavalry unable to follow through the dense terrain. The Mongols had won the beach, but the battle for Tsushima was far from over. As dawn began to break, the samurai regrouped in the mountains, their numbers dwindling but their spirits unbroken. They had survived the impossible. But Sukekuni knew the worst was still to come. The Mongols had claimed the beaches. Next, they would come for the island itself. The Mongols had taken the beaches, but the island was far from conquered. Smoke still curled into the sky from the devastation their bombardment had left behind. And yet, despite their overwhelming numbers and terrifying new weapons, they had failed to deliver the crushing blow they had expected. The samurai had fought with a ferocity beyond anything they had encountered, striking like ghosts, vanishing into the forests and hills before the Mongols could fully pin them down. It was not a victory. It was merely the opening act of a much longer war. As the first light of dawn crept across the horizon, General Lu Fuxiang stood atop the command deck of his flagship, surveying the battlefield from the safety of the sea. The shoreline was littered with the bodies of his fallen warriors, their blood mixing with the tide. The first wave had been a disaster. The samurai had cut through his soldiers with terrifying precision, using the land itself as their greatest ally. But now the Mongols had their foothold, and they would not make the same mistake twice. A signal was given, and a new wave of landing craft pushed toward the shore. Thousands more soldiers, fresh and fully armed, poured onto the beaches, reinforcing the battered survivors of the previous assault. The Mongols had paid for their first steps onto Japanese soil in blood, but they would not stop. From the forests above, the samurai watched in silence. Lord Sukekuni wiped the sweat from his brow, his breathing steady but heavy. His men had fought with honor, but the reality was undeniable. They were running out of time. His forces had taken heavy losses in the night battle. Many of his warriors were wounded, others exhausted beyond their limits, and yet they could not stop fighting. To surrender was unthinkable. To flee was impossible. There was only one path forward, to bleed the Mongols for every step they took. The samurai had lured the invaders into the mountains for a reason. Here, on this rugged terrain, numbers meant nothing. Cavalry was useless in the dense forests. Mongol archers could not fire effectively through the thick canopy. The terrain itself was a weapon. The Mongols had fought on open plains, in deserts, in cities with wide streets. But Tsushima? Tsushima was a battlefield built for the samurai. As the Mongols pushed forward, unaware of the trap being set, the first strikes came without warning. A volley of arrows rained down from the trees, cutting through the invaders before they even realized they were under attack. Silent figures moved between the shadows, striking from nowhere, cutting men down, then vanishing before the Mongols could retaliate. Confusion spread through the ranks. The Mongols had assumed the battle was over after taking the beach. They had expected a broken enemy, retreating in fear. Instead, they had entered a nightmare. General Lu Fuxiang cursed under his breath as the first reports came in. The samurai were not retreating, they were hunting them. From the treetops, small bands of warriors struck with deadly precision, using the Mongols' own tactics against them. Ambushes, sudden retreats, hit-and-run attacks. This was not the honorable, structured battle that the samurai were known for. This was survival warfare. For the Mongols, used to crushing their enemies in open fields, this was something entirely different. They were being forced into narrow mountain paths, into ravines where their numbers counted for nothing. The more they advanced, the more they played into the samurai's hands. A Mongol officer led his unit through a tight pass, the high cliffs on either side casting eerie shadows over their march. The warriors moved cautiously, weapons drawn, eyes scanning the trees. And then, without warning, the mountain itself collapsed upon them. The samurai had spent days preparing rock slides, placing carefully positioned boulders above key trails. As the Mongols marched below, warriors hidden high in the cliffs released the stones. A thunderous roar filled the valley as tons of rock crashed down upon the invaders, crushing them instantly. Screams echoed through the mountains. Another wave of Mongols lost. The Mongol commanders were furious. They had never faced an enemy like this. They had conquered entire nations. Yet this one island was bleeding them dry. But then, something changed. The Mongols stopped chasing shadows. Instead, they set the forests on fire. Flaming arrows shot into the trees, igniting the dry underbrush. Smoke billowed across the battlefield, choking the air, forcing the samurai out of their hiding places. Where stealth had once been their greatest advantage, now the Mongols had flipped the battlefield against them. Sukekuni's men coughed as thick, black smoke filled their lungs. The fires spread faster than they had anticipated. The very land they had relied upon had now become their enemy. Through the haze, the Mongols advanced, their armor darkened by soot, their weapons gleaming beneath the inferno's light. The battle was changing. The samurai, forced into the open, now had no choice but to fight directly. And so they did. The next clash was unlike anything the Mongols had faced before. The samurai warriors, now in full view, fought like demons, unyielding, relentless, cutting through wave after wave of invaders. Blades clashed. Blood soaked the earth. A Mongol horseman, one of their finest cavalrymen, charged toward Sukekuni, his spear aimed for the samurai's heart. With a single, fluid motion, Sukekuni sidestepped the thrust, drawing his sword in a flash and slicing the rider from his mount. The Mongol collapsed in the dirt, dead before he hit the ground. Another warrior lunged toward him, a Korean soldier wielding a long spear. Sukekuni parried, spun, and cut him down in one seamless motion. His men fought beside him back to back, refusing to break. The Mongols, relentless in their assault, pressed harder. Their sheer numbers were beginning to overwhelm the defenders. The samurai, no matter how skilled, could not hold forever. More warriors fell. More blood stained the mountain soil. Sukekuni knew the end was near, yet he fought on. Atop the cliffs, a young samurai who had barely seen 20 winters stood bleeding, his body shaking from exhaustion, his sword arm heavy. He watched as his comrades fell one by one, as the Mongols climbed over the bodies of the dead to press further inland. He knew they would not survive, and so, with the last of his strength, he threw down his helmet, raised his sword, and charged into the Mongol lines alone. The Mongols turned in surprise as the young warrior cut into their ranks, fighting with a fury so intense that, for a moment, they hesitated. But there were too many. A Mongol blade found its mark. The young samurai staggered, falling to his knees, his blood pooling beneath him. He smiled. Then, with the last of his breath, he whispered his final words. "Tell them we did not kneel." And then he was gone. The samurai were losing ground. Their warriors were falling. Sukekuni, wounded and breathing heavily, watched as the Mongols pushed further into Tsushima. The island's fate was hanging by a thread. But the battle was not yet over, because the storm was coming, and with it, a force that even the Mongols could not control. The fires raged across Tsushima, the mountains illuminated by the eerie glow of destruction. Smoke coiled through the valleys, turning the once pristine forests into a battlefield where shadows twisted and danced like restless spirits. The Mongols, having learned from their failures, now advanced with ruthless precision. Their war drums echoed across the island, a relentless, pounding reminder that the tide had turned. Lord Sukekuni wiped the blood from his eyes, his breathing ragged. His men had fought beyond their limits, striking like phantoms in the night, cutting down invaders by the dozens. But now the battle had changed. The Mongols had set the land itself against them. The burning forests forced his warriors from their defensive positions, smoke blinding them, heat searing their skin as they struggled to maneuver. The traps they had spent days preparing, the natural terrain they had used to their advantage, all of it was slipping away. And yet they did not stop fighting. From the hills, samurai archers loosed their final volleys, arrows streaking through the smoke like falling stars. Each arrow found its mark. A Mongol officer clutching his throat, a cavalryman tumbling from his horse, a foot soldier collapsing mid-step. But for every Mongol that fell, two more took his place. The enemy was unrelenting, and now, for the first time, they had broken through. Sukekuni heard the horns first, the deep, guttural calls of Mongol commanders signaling the next phase of the assault. Then came the heavy thunder of hooves. The Mongol heavy cavalry had finally found open ground. The warriors of the Khan were fearsome enough on foot, but their true strength had always been in the saddle. Raised from childhood to fight on horseback, they moved like shadows across the battlefield, firing arrows even at full gallop, striking down their enemies with chilling precision. And now they had room to charge. A low tremor shook the earth as the Mongol cavalry surged forward, steel flashing, hoofs pounding, their battle cries mixing with the deafening roar of the flames. Sukekuni barely had time to react before the first impact sent his men flying. The cavalry smashed through the samurai ranks like a battering ram, lances skewering warriors mid-strike, swords hacking through armor with terrifying speed. A horseman barreled toward Sukekuni, his curved saber raised high. The Mongol warrior's face was expressionless, calm, methodical, merciless. Sukekuni sidestepped the charge at the last moment, his katana a blur of motion. A single stroke, clean, precise, and the Mongol fell, his body tumbling from the saddle, blood spraying across the scorched earth. But there were too many. The samurai tried to regroup, but the second wave of cavalry struck like a hammer, shattering what remained of their formation. The battlefield became a storm of flashing steel and crimson mist, warriors locked in combat so fierce that the very ground seemed to tremble beneath them. Sukekuni saw his men fall, one by one, cut down under the weight of sheer numbers. He fought as fiercely as he had ever fought in his life, his sword a blur, his armor stained with the blood of his enemies. But he knew the end was near. Across the battlefield, a Mongol officer raised a crimson banner, signaling the final push. The remaining samurai, exhausted, wounded, their bodies screaming for rest, tightened their grips on their swords. They knew what came next. The Mongols would not take prisoners. Sukekuni turned to his warriors. His voice, though hoarse, still carried over the chaos. Samurai do not die in retreat. We do not beg. We do not kneel. There was no hesitation, no fear, only resolve. With a final battle cry, the remaining samurai charged. Blades clashed, armor shattered, blood darkened the dirt. But the Mongols were overwhelming. The samurai were outnumbered 50-1. And yet, they fought like men who had already embraced death. One warrior, bleeding from a dozen wounds, threw himself at the Mongol line, cutting down two men before a spear found his chest. Another, his armor shattered, fought with only his wakizashi, slicing through the enemy before he was dragged down and silenced beneath a flurry of blades. Still, the samurai did not break. Then the sky rumbled. A deep, unnatural growl rolled across the island. The Mongols barely noticed it at first, too focused on slaughtering the last defenders of Tsushima. But then the wind shifted. The flames that had once worked in their favor suddenly whipped in the opposite direction, twisting like living things, rising higher, hungrier. Then came the first gust, a violent, howling wind that tore across the battlefield, kicking up embers, swirling the smoke into blinding clouds. The Mongols faltered. Something was wrong. Sukekuni, bleeding, barely able to stand, looked to the sky. His breath caught in his throat. The clouds were moving fast. Dark, swirling masses churned above the sea, rolling toward the shore like an advancing army. Then it happened. The storm hit. A monstrous gust of wind slammed into the Mongol fleet, tearing through their formation like an invisible wave of destruction. The warships, which had seemed so immovable, so unstoppable, now bucked and groaned beneath the fury of the storm. The Mongol commanders screamed orders, but it was too late. The first ship was ripped from its moorings, slammed into the jagged rocks of the coastline, breaking apart like paper in a hurricane. Then another, and another. The samurai, who had been moments from death, now watched as nature itself turned against their enemies. Winds howled. Lightning split the sky. The sea, once calm, became a monster. The Mongols, still on land, tried to regroup, but their fleet was being shattered before their eyes. The warships burned, capsized, crashed into one another in the raging waters. The Mongols, who had come as the unquestioned masters of conquest, now faced something even they could not fight. A divine wind, kamikaze. The very forces of nature had answered the prayers of Japan. Sukekuni, battered and broken, fell to his knees, watching in awe as the invincible Mongol fleet was torn apart. The enemy had won the battle, but Japan had won the war. As dawn broke over the ruined beaches, the few surviving Mongols, leaderless, broken, and terrified, fled to their remaining ships, retreating across the sea. The first invasion of Japan had failed. Tsushima had been devastated. The samurai had been wiped out. But they had done what no army in the world had ever done. They had defied the Mongol Empire. They had forced the greatest war machine in history to retreat. And though the island was left in ruin, its warriors fallen, the legend of Tsushima was just beginning. The battlefield was silent. Where once the Mongol war drums had pounded, where once the cries of warriors had clashed in the fury of battle, there was now only the sound of the wind howling through the scorched forests. Smoke curled into the sky, mingling with the dawn light. The very earth itself bore the scars of the battle, charred remains of the once proud trees, blood-stained soil, shattered weapons scattered like broken dreams. Tsushima had fallen. And yet, in a way no one had expected, Tsushima had won. The Mongols had been driven back, not by swords, not by strategy alone, but by the wrath of the divine wind, the kamikaze, that had torn their fleet apart. Hundreds of their ships lay shattered against the jagged coastline, their once mighty war machines reduced to splintered wreckage, their warriors drowned beneath the merciless waves. Those who had made it back to their ships were left clinging to the ruins of their invasion force, leaderless, broken, and afraid. Among the ruins of the battlefield, the last samurai stood. Lord Sukekuni, bleeding from wounds too numerous to count, watched the ocean, his body barely able to hold itself upright. His armor, once a proud symbol of his clan, was now tattered and soaked in blood. His own, his men's, and that of his enemies. His katana, chipped and worn, still rested in his grip. It had not left his hand since the battle had begun. Around him, the few remaining warriors of Tsushima surveyed the destruction. Of the 200 who had stood against the Mongol Empire, fewer than a dozen remained. They were exhausted, barely alive, their bodies broken but their spirits unshaken. Sukekuni turned to his warriors, his voice hoarse but unwavering. "It is done." The words carried across the ruins of the battlefield. They had held. They had fought beyond the limits of human endurance. And even in death, their fallen brothers had defied the greatest empire the world had ever known. But there was no celebration, no victory cries, only silence. The Mongols may have been forced to retreat, but the cost had been unspeakable. Tsushima, the island that had stood as Japan's first line of defense, was now little more than a graveyard. The villages that had once bustled with life lay in ruins. The people who had called this island home, fishermen, farmers, artisans, had been caught in the storm of war. Some had fled to the mountains. Others had not been so fortunate. Sukekuni's heart was heavy. He had known from the beginning that this would be their fate. He had never fought for survival. He had fought to slow the Mongols, to make them bleed, to buy Japan time. And he had done so, but he also knew the truth. Kublai Khan would return. The Mongols were not an enemy that accepted failure. The great Khan had never suffered defeat before, and he would not allow this humiliation to go unanswered. This was not the end. This was only the beginning. The second invasion was already being prepared. 7 years later, in 1281, Kublai Khan would launch an even larger invasion, with over 4,000 ships and more than 140,000 warriors, the single greatest naval force in human history. This time, he would not simply raid Japan's shores. He would wipe the samurai from existence. But what he did not know, what he could not understand, was that Tsushima had changed everything. The samurai who had fallen here had left more than just their bodies behind. They had left a lesson. Japan had seen what was coming. The emperor, the shogunate, and the warlords had witnessed the horror of the Mongol war machine and had learned from it. Defenses were rebuilt. Samurai were trained in new tactics. Fortresses rose along the shores. When the Mongols returned in 1281, they would not face a scattered resistance. They would face a nation that had been preparing for them. And once again, the divine wind would rise. Once again, the ocean itself would turn against the invaders. Once again, the samurai would stand. And this time, they would not just survive, they would win. Tsushima had been the first stand, the impossible battle, the fight that should have ended in complete annihilation. But instead, it had become something greater. A legend, a warning, a ghost story whispered across the Mongol Empire. A tale of an island that refused to fall, of warriors who fought beyond death, of an unseen force that had shattered an invincible army. Even Kublai Khan, the most powerful ruler in the world, could not erase what had happened here. He could not explain it away. The Mongol chronicles would call it a strategic withdrawal due to adverse weather. But the truth was written in blood on Tsushima's beaches. The first invasion of Japan had failed. And as the sun rose over the smoldering island, as the last surviving samurai sheathed their swords, one thing became clear. This was not just a battle. This was the moment an empire was stopped. And though the names of the fallen might one day be forgotten, their spirits would never fade, because they had stood when no one else could. They had defied the impossible, and history would never forget them. The winds had settled. The ocean, which had raged with fury just hours before, now lapped quietly against the blood-soaked shores of Tsushima. The great Mongol fleet, once an unstoppable force of conquest, lay shattered, splintered hulls drifting in the tide, bodies of fallen warriors claimed by the sea, the cries of survivors lost in the vast emptiness of the morning mist. Yet, despite this devastation, Tsushima stood in ruin. Lord Sosukakuni had watched the battle unfold to its bitter end. His sword, stained with the blood of invaders and brothers alike, now hung limply at his side. His body was broken, his armor barely holding together, and yet he still stood. The price of resistance had been paid in full. The people of Tsushima, those who had not fled, had seen their homes burned, their temples desecrated, their loved ones lost. But they had not bowed. Among the few surviving samurai, silence hung like a shroud. They were men without illusions. They had not won. Victory was not measured in how many enemies they had slain, but in what they had left behind. Their battle was not fought for glory, not for survival, but for time, for Japan to awaken, to see the storm that was coming and prepare before it was too late. And now the storm had passed. The Mongols, what few remained, had retreated to the open sea. Some ships, still seaworthy, limped away toward Korea, carrying the humiliated survivors of an empire that had never known failure. Kublai Khan's war machine had been halted but not stopped. Sukakuni knew this was no final victory. The Mongols would return, and next time they would bring an even greater force. He turned his gaze to the wreckage-strewn coast, where the once proud fleet of the Khan had been broken by the sea itself. The divine wind, the kamikaze, had done what his warriors alone could not. Was it fate? Was it coincidence? Or was it something more? The emperor's priests would call it a gift from the heavens, proof that Japan was a sacred land, protected by forces beyond human understanding. But Sukekuni did not dwell on prophecy. He knew one thing for certain. If Japan did not learn from Tsushima, there would be nothing left to protect. The fires still burned in the remains of Tsushima's villages. The people, those who had survived, emerged from hiding, faces hollow, eyes filled with the kind of pain that never fades. The war had come and gone, leaving them with nothing but ashes and ghosts. Their protectors, the samurai who had sworn to defend them, were now fewer than ever before. But they had not failed. The emperor in Kyoto would soon hear of Tsushima's fate. The shogunate, those who had hesitated when the first whispers of invasion reached them, would now understand the magnitude of the enemy they faced. There could be no more doubt. The Mongols would return, and when they did, Japan had to be ready. Sukekuni gathered the survivors. His warriors, his brothers in arms, the men who had fought beyond the limits of human endurance, the men who should have died alongside the rest. But fate had chosen them to witness what came next. "You have seen the enemy," he said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion. "You have fought them, and now you will be the ones to warn Japan." There was no argument, no hesitation. They understood their duty. So, as the last embers of battle smoldered on Tsushima's soil, messengers were sent. Survivors crossed the waters to the Japanese mainland, carrying the truth. The Mongols had come, and they would come again. The samurai who had fallen at Tsushima did not die in vain. They had become the first great warning of what was to come. And so Japan began to prepare. Walls were built. Fortifications rose along the shores of Hakata Bay, the next likely target of invasion. New weapons were forged. The samurai, already fearsome warriors, adapted. They learned from the Mongols. They studied their tactics, their weaknesses. Japan had faced an enemy unlike any other, and now it would ensure that when the next storm came, it would not be caught unprepared. And so the years passed. Kublai Khan, humiliated by the failure of his fleet, refused to accept defeat. The thought of Japan, a small island nation, defying the might of the Mongol Empire burned within him like a wound that refused to heal. He had conquered China. He had ruled over vast lands stretching from Korea to Persia. How could Japan remain beyond his grasp? And so, in 1281, the Khan sent the largest invasion force in history. Over 140,000 warriors, more than 4,000 ships, a fleet so massive that it turned the ocean black with its sails. This time, Kublai Khan would not be denied. But what he did not know, what he could never have predicted, was that Japan had been waiting for him. The lessons of Tsushima had not been forgotten. The samurai who had once fought alone now stood united. The Mongols landed again in even greater numbers, but they did not find a scattered resistance. They found a Japan that had turned Tsushima's sacrifice into strength. And then, it happened again. The wind rose, the sky darkened, the ocean churned, and the divine wind, the kamikaze, returned. In a single night, the greatest invasion fleet the world had ever seen was obliterated. Ships were tossed into the sky like leaves in a typhoon. Warriors who had braved 1,000 battles were dragged beneath the waves, swallowed by the sea itself. The Mongols, so close to victory, so sure of their conquest, were shattered. Not by swords, not by arrows, but by the very forces of nature. Kublai Khan would never attempt to invade Japan again. The Mongol Empire had been stopped, not by any army, not by any ruler, but by the will of an island that refused to bow. And it had all begun on the shores of Tsushima, where 200 samurai made their stand, where men fought against impossible odds, not for victory, but for something greater. And though their names may have faded with time, their spirits remained. in every samurai who would take up the sword in the centuries to come, in every whisper of the wind that passed through the mountains of Japan, and in every tide that lapped against the shores where history was written in blood and steel. The Battle of Tsushima was more than just a battle. It was the moment the Mongols were stopped, the moment Japan became unbreakable, and the moment when the legend of the samurai was forged in fire, wind, and war. The winds of history never truly settle. Long after the fires of war had faded from Tsushima's shores, the echoes of that battle carried through the centuries, shaping the soul of Japan. The names of the warriors who stood against the Mongols may have been lost to time, but their defiance, their refusal to kneel before an empire that had conquered half the known world, became something far greater than memory. It became legend. The sacrifice of Tsushima did more than warn Japan of the Mongol threat. It became a foundation, a moment that changed the very identity of the samurai forever. Before Tsushima, war in Japan had been a matter of feudal disputes, clan rivalries, and internal power struggles. But after Tsushima, everything changed. For the first time, Japan had faced an enemy not of its own making, an enemy from beyond its shores. For the first time, the samurai were no longer just warriors fighting for their lords. They were the last line of defense for their entire homeland. And they had proven themselves worthy of that duty. In Kyoto, the imperial court received the first reports of the invasion with horror. Messengers who had survived the battle told of Mongol ships stretching beyond the horizon, of thunderous weapons that had torn through the forests, of a horde that had never before been defeated in war. But they also told of something else. They spoke of a handful of samurai standing against thousands, of warriors who fought despite knowing they would die, of men who chose death over dishonor. And that, more than anything, terrified Kublai Khan. The Mongols had not merely encountered resistance. They had faced a kind of defiance they did not understand. They had expected submission, surrender, the same as they had seen in China, in Korea, in Persia. But the samurai did not fight to survive. They fought because their very existence demanded it. And so, the myth of Mongol invincibility was shattered. The defeat at Tsushima, followed by the catastrophic failure of the second invasion in 1281, was not merely a military loss for Kublai Khan. It was the first time the Mongol war machine had been stopped completely and utterly. And it left a scar upon the empire that would never fully heal. The warriors who survived Tsushima did not return as broken men. They returned as warnings. The lessons of the battle were studied, engraved into the minds of every samurai lord in Japan. The Mongols had not fought honorably. They had used tactics unseen in Japan before. Mass bombardment, psychological warfare, cavalry shock assaults. This was war on a scale Japan had never imagined. And so, Japan adapted. After Tsushima, the shogunate ordered the construction of coastal fortifications, preparing for the inevitable return of the Mongols. Samurai were retrained in new tactics. Defensive warfare became just as important as offense. Military leaders began studying Mongol strategies, their weaknesses, their strengths. By the time the Mongols returned in 1281, Japan was no longer an unprepared nation. It was a fortress. The beaches were lined with stone walls. The samurai were no longer relying on open-field combat. They were ready. And when the battle came, when the Mongols landed once more, Japan held its ground. Until once again the wind rose. The second divine wind, kamikaze, swept through the Mongol fleet, destroying what remained of Kublai Khan's ambition. The Mongols never returned, and Japan would never again be invaded for nearly 700 years. But even as history moved forward, the spirits of Tsushima never left. For centuries, the story of the 200 samurai who stood alone was passed down through generations, whispered in the halls of temples, told by firelight in the homes of warriors. It became part of the very fabric of Japan's identity. The concept of Bushido, the way of the warrior, was forever shaped by the lessons of Tsushima. It was no longer just about skill in combat. It was about duty. It was about sacrifice. It was about choosing to stand, even when there was no hope. The samurai of Tsushima had fought knowing they would not survive. And yet, their deaths had shaped the course of history. And that, more than any victory, was what made them immortal. The samurai's final resting place. The island today. Even now, on the quiet, wind-swept island of Tsushima, the echoes of that battle remain. The beaches where the Mongols first landed are still there. The forests where the samurai made their final stand still whisper with the wind. And scattered across the island, there are graves. Small stone markers, weathered by time, standing in silent tribute to the men who fought against the impossible. To this day, visitors come to Tsushima to pay their respects, to walk the paths where history was written in blood and fire. And some say, if you stand upon the cliffs at sunset, where the last warriors of Tsushima once watched the enemy approach, you can still hear the faint echoes of battle, the clash of steel, the war cries of samurai who refused to fall, the whisper of the wind that came to claim them in the end. A reminder that true warriors never die. Tsushima was more than a battle. It was a testament to the unbreakable human spirit. The Mongols should have won. They had the numbers, the weapons, the most powerful army in the world. And yet, they were stopped by a handful of warriors who chose death over surrender. History is full of battles fought for power, for conquest, for riches. But Tsushima was different. It was a battle fought for honor, for duty, for the right to stand unbroken in the face of an empire that believed itself unstoppable. And that, in the end, was why the Mongols lost. Because Tsushima was never just an island. It was a message that still echoes across time. Even when the enemy is greater, even when hope is lost, we do not kneel. We do not surrender. We stand. And we fight. And sometimes, when warriors refuse to bow, the gods themselves rise to fight alongside them.